Hey everyone, welcome back to The Satisfied Philosophy. Today I'm going to be discussing the paper and thesis of the philosopher Dr. Joshua Sijuwade, who has a recent paper come out called The Pan-Abrahamic Problem. Several people on YouTube have interviewed him before, those being the channel most famous, in my view, is Gabriel Sayed Reynolds, who is an academic scholar on Christianity and Islam, and he interviewed Sijuwade because Sijuwade started his paper as highly, it's basically a philosophical approach to the scholarly thesis of the book by Fred Donner in 2010. So to break down these terms, basically, Fred Donner wrote a book in 2010. It basically just argued that the early community of Muslims was an ecumenical community, which means that it involved Christians and Jews in it. And the requirement to be in the early Islamic community, and this was under when Muhammad was alive and up until the Caliph Malik, so we're talking the end of the 600s, to be a believer in early Islam, you had to be monotheistic, believe in one God. You had to believe that works are required, being good, doing good works is required. And then three, you had to hold to some ritual points. But the main point was that you had to be monotheistic, right? So Fred Donner's thesis has been accepted largely in Islamic studies, right? It's a very well argued thesis. Some people that have taken issues with it, such as Patricia Cole, who is a great scholar herself. She took issues with it because she thinks that it doesn't take into account the full breadth of the Quran. But these critiques have been minimal. Largely, the scholarly world has accepted Donner's thesis. And so what Sijuwade is doing is he's taking a philosophical approach to this. He's saying, okay, accept Donner's historical thesis. Okay, what does this mean for the fate of non-Muslims, basically, right? Because if the idea is that, well, his focus really is that what does this mean for the Islam today? Because if Islam isn't the same religion as it was when it was started, because Islam today is an exclusivist religion and early Islam was an inclusivist religion, what does this mean for the claims of Muslims today that they are following Muhammad? Are they not in fact just following the Caliphate Malik, right? So that's his argument. And then towards the very end of the paper, he talks a little bit about what does this mean about the fate of non-believers. So he kind of works a little bit off of the scholarship already done by this guy named Juan Cole, who wrote I believe a 2017 or 2018 book, talking more about early Islam, accepting Donner's thesis, and then kind of speculating a bit about what this would mean for the early soteriological claims of early Islam, like with this scholarly understanding of its origins, right? So what he's doing, and at the very end, is he's kind of saying, like, did early Islam have a soteriological pluralism or salvific pluralism? That is to say, if Christians and Jews were part of early Islam and part of the Muhammad community and allowed to be, does this mean that Muhammad taught that they would be saved as well, right? So the idea is, can a monotheist be saved? And that's the question. And so Sijuwade, he sticks on the philosophical side. I more history side. So what I want to center on is precisely the topic of my appendix of my book, Grace Abounds, where the appendix of my book is about the philosopher Ibn Taymiyyah, a 13th century Sunni philosopher, and then also the overall history of Islamic Universalism. So one of the main things that I like to center on are several hadiths from the Sunni tradition collected by al-Bukhari. So, just for some background, if you are unaware, a hadith is a claimed statement by Muhammad. So a bunch of hadiths were collected in various collections by people such as al-Bukhari and others who were in some sense close to the Prophet, like maybe the daughter and then an uncle or something like that. So there was some sort of close ties so that the person was relatively close to the Prophet and was close in terms of geographical distance and in terms of the years, right? You're not supposed to have hadiths collected in the 1800s about Muhammad, but in some Shia circles, we'll say that does happen. But whatever. So the several particular Bukhari hadiths come to mind, and these hadiths are particularly labeled as Sahih, meaning that they are authentic. Sahih is the highest level of authenticity a hadith can get, meaning that hadith scholars, who are Islamic scholars, Ummah, the Islamic Ummah, they look at these hadiths and they have some sort of methodology, which I can't go into right now, it's too much, but it can also be disputed, which I do dispute its validity, but assuming the validity of hadith science here, they use a scientific method of sorts of their own to determine which hadiths go back to Muhammad and which don't. And so these hadiths are rated Sahih, meaning that they very likely go back to Muhammad on a Muslim's standard. Okay, so I don't really care if they do, right? In terms of the, I don't have any personal investment, but a historical interest is that these hadiths following Muslim standards do go back to Muhammad. Okay, so with that said, one of these hadiths is quoted in full by Ibn Taymiyyah in his book, A Response to Those Who Believe Hell Will Be Forever. That's basically it. So here's the quote. After they, disbelievers, have crossed the Sirat, they will be confined at a bridge between the garden and the fire. Then, when they have been cleansed and purified, they can enter the garden. So a Sirat is a bridge, basically. It's pretty self-explanatory, but there's a very deep theological significance and history of the Sirat in Islamic theology. It's sort of understood as, I would say, sort of maybe like a purgatorial middle position between heaven and hell, where it's like this bridge that people can cross over, right? And that some people are stuck on the bridge. They're kind of teetering. If you imagine a cliffside and two cliffs next to each other, and a bridge going down the middle of them, right? You might say that the Sirat is that bridge, and some people can be on the bridge, and the bridge is, shaking and it's wobbly, and they're trying to make their way to Jannah or heaven, but the fire or hell is pulling them back. So what's clear from this Bukhari hadith is that after they, disbelievers, have crossed the Sirat, so this is according to Bukhari, this comes from Muhammad. He's saying that after disbelievers have crossed the bridge, they will be cleansed and purified, right? So following Sijuwade's thesis, this would track. If early Islam, according to Donner's scholarly work, was indeed a religiously pluralistic society, right? And there's many primary source documents, such as the Medina Constitution, which we could hit on, but that's a different topic altogether. If following Donner's thesis, what we could say is that this seems, assuming this really does go back pretty early, maybe to Muhammad himself, that this would track, right? That this is a salvific pluralist idea, right? That, maybe it was very well, probably could be the case that maybe some people in Muhammad's community were super, super into Muhammad, and and they haven't given up some of their Christian or Jewish ways, and so those people, maybe Muhammad and his followers, his closest followers, his companions, were like, hey, you're going to not have to go to Gehenna at all. You're not going to have to go to the fire at all. You're going to come with me immediately to paradise. But then to the Christians and Jews, he's like, you'll eventually make it with me in paradise. So that could very well be an explanation of why this religious pluralism still has the notion that the disbelievers will go to Gehenna for a time. Now, some other hadiths that I would like to hit on is Bukhari 3194, which means you can type that in on Google. Bukhari 3194 reads, quote, when Allah completed the creation, he wrote in his book, which is with him on the throne, my mercy overpowers my anger. So for someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, this hadith is very clear that Allah's anger towards disbelievers will eventually be overcome by his own mercy towards disbelievers. Now, a more likely contender for universalism that's very explicit is Bukhari 6571, if you want to look it up. Quote, the Prophet said, I know the person who will be the last to come out of the fire and the last to enter paradise. He will be a man who will come out of the fire crawling, and Allah will say to him, go and enter paradise. He will go to it, but he will imagine that he has been filled. Then he will return and say, O Lord, I have found it full. Allah will say, go and enter paradise, and you will have what equals the world and 10 times as much. So, just to go over the point, is that the last person to leave the fire. So that you automatically have that at the start of the hadith. You have the last person to leave the fire, which presumes that there is going to be a time when there will be no fire. And then it's, well, what happens to that last person? Well, he's crawling, right? He's been in the fire for a long time. But then Allah says that he will go to paradise and he will have what the world has times 10. So he will be, blessed beyond compare when the last person leaves the fire. So again, this is a Sahih hadith, meaning that according to Islamic standards, Sunni Islamic standards, this goes back to Muhammad. Okay, so the issue that I draw with this is that it doesn't specify who the last man is, right? Maybe there could be a sort of addendum to this, right? Or maybe Muhammad after was like, oh, by the last man, I just mean the last, the last believer, I don't mean, specifically the last pagan, right? But following Donner's thesis, and this is something I don't particularly say in the book, but I do kind of imply it in a footnote, if Donner's thesis is true, then Muhammad might have really just meant the last monotheist. And I think that is a point that I say is the most likely, right? I don't, maybe he meant the last pagan, but I don't think so, at least with what we have here. He definitely, I don't think just meant the last Muslim in the way that we understand Islam today. I think that he probably meant the last monotheist, taking into account Donner's thesis, right, of a pluralistic community. So I can give another example of a hadith. Here, I'll give a companion report. So this is from the companion Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who is the second greatest interpreter of the Quran ever, according to Sunni, according to the Sunni Ajima, or the Sunni consensus of scholars, right? So he taught that there will be a day in hell where nobody will remain in it after they have dwelt there for ages, or akhab. So ages, akhab is a pretty polysemic word in Arabic. And earlier in the appendix, I discuss how it's quite loose, and it doesn't mean eternality. It doesn't really mean ages. It kind of just has a very shifting definition depending on the context. But for our sake here, the point is that the companion, the second greatest interpreter of the Quran ever, according to Sunnis, says that there will be a day in hell where nobody will remain. Right. So again, perhaps if this really goes back to the companion, this follows from Donner's thesis that as the early Islam was a religiously pluralistic community, right? That's pretty crazy, right? Now here's another one. This is from, we can do the companion Umar. Now what's interesting about Umar is that Umar plays directly into Donner's thesis, because Umar, and this is so interesting, he had a very cordial meeting and seemingly relationship with the Patriarch of Jerusalem at the time, Sophronios. So the Christian Sophronios, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, seemed to have a cordial relationship with Umar, the companion of Muhammad, and following Donner, this would make sense because the early Muslims were not exclusivist. So this reading from Umar is extremely fascinating. Donner doesn't talk about any of this. Neither does Sijuwade, right? This is all my scholarship that I'm trying to add onto their arguments to make them stronger. So behind Abu Bakr, Umar is the second greatest companion, not second greatest interpreter of the Quran, right? Granted, I mentioned that was Abdullah, right? But second greatest companions, just overall, he's like Muhammad's second top guy, like behind Abu Bakr, which is that's pretty big status. So what Umar says is that even if the people of the fire stay there for many years, there will eventually be a day when they will come out. As I mentioned, he is one of the closest sources to Muhammad, and this statement from Umar would not only fit that Donner's thesis, but it would also fit the earlier hadiths from Muhammad. Wouldn't it make sense that Muhammad's top companion, or second top companion, and second greatest interpreter of the Quran, who was just with Muhammad all the time, would be universalist if Muhammad was not their darling prophet, their darling teacher, right? So these points, these three hadiths and these two companion reports really add strength to Donner's thesis. And whether or not we want to say these literally go back to the companions or Muhammad himself, it doesn't really matter. They're early. They're definitely early. I think that one thing that hadiths science can be trusted on is that it tends to get it right that the hadiths that are Sahih are early. They may not go back to Muhammad, may not be words literally said, but they are early in the Islamic tradition. And again, following this for at least the first 60 years, 70 years of Islam, it was a religiously pluralistic community. So again, I'm just giving reasons to support Donner's thesis and support Joshua Sijuwade's continued philosophical engagement with it. So, I think those are fine. But yeah, basically, so those are some pretty strong statements from people close to Muhammad and Muhammad himself. And I say that, if these are historical, or you can maybe make an argument for their historicity with the fact of Donner's thesis. I haven't done that, but I would be very interested in someone that would do that would take these and more reports, hadiths from Muhammad and reports of the companions, and create a whole thesis that, wow, look, we can actually judge the authenticity of these hadiths perhaps by the fact that this thesis is true. So, that's something that would be very fascinating to go in the future, but that's where I'm at right now. I just wanted to share that. I watched that video of Dr. Joshua Sijuwade, and I read his paper 2 weeks ago. And so it really just sparked my mind about how I've already done scholarship on this. So yeah, if you would like to continue reading, I got another 14 pages in the appendix, and there's about 400 pages in here, so in total. So I highly recommend Abounds. Check it out for Christian Universalism and the history thereof, and then that little bit on Islamic Universalism in the back, which is a very understudied topic, and I am one of the few who has directly engaged it. So thank you, and have a nice day.